The Super Nintendo Entertainment System was my first real experience of being a gamer when I was actually old enough to comprehend what I was seeing and what I was doing, and it's still one of my favorite consoles ever made. The software library is huge at 722 titles released in North America, and it's filled with amazing games, but there are those titles that clearly stand above the rest. So today I thought I'd sit down and list off my top 10 games for the SNES. At last, something totally fresh and original. Just what YouTube needs. Let's make a top 10 list. But first, let's run down some honorable mentions, because this was a harder list to put together than I originally thought, and probably should have been a top 20. First, Killer Instinct. This game blew me away as a kid with its graphics, sound, cool characters, and kick-ass gameplay. It was the only fighting game that for me competed with the likes of Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter at the time. Contra 3: The Alien Wars. Don't need to say too much about this one. It's one of the best run-and-guns ever made with outstanding visuals and sound design. It was balls hard, but still tons of fun. Doubly so if you had a second player with you. Sunset Riders, another amazing Konami run-and-gun, kind of like Contra, but with cowboys, which is a premise that basically sells itself. Again, a game with great visuals and sound and super fun, addictive gameplay that gets even better with some co-op. Gradius 3, this was my introduction to the shoot-'em-up genre, and at first I admittedly hated it and felt like I'd wasted a rental because it was so damn difficult, but as I spent more time with it and got better at it, it grew on me until it became one of my all-time favorite shooters, and a game that at least at one time I could easily 1cc. Great graphics and sound and stellar gameplay, a perfect launch title for the SNES. Finally, we have Earthworm Jim, which was a very tough call. The only reason it's not in my top 10 is because it's a game that I actually played on the Sega Genesis when it first came out, while my top 10 is comprised of games that I loved specifically on the SNES as a kid, and still do. EWJ on the SNES still featured amazing graphics and sound design and great gameplay that took the platforming genre through a few fun twists and turns. Jim himself is a great character, and this is a great game. Now, on with the top 10 goodness. At number 10, I have X-Men Mutant Apocalypse, which might surprise some people. I don't think I've ever seen this one on anybody else's top 10, but at the time of its release in 1994, this was absolutely the perfect game for me. I loved the X-Men, both the comics and the animated series, and I loved basically anything with a Capcom logo on it, but especially Mega Man X and Street Fighter. So when I discovered that there was an X-Men game made by Capcom that was a hybrid of platformer and beat-em-up with Street Fighter style special attacks, it was like someone read my mind and made a game just for me. To this day, if I ever have an hour to kill, I can blast through this game and still have a great time doing it. Solid gameplay, great visuals, and an outstanding soundtrack make this one an all-time classic, at least for me. At number 9, I have Donkey Kong Country, which is a game that blew me away when I was 8 years old. I didn't think any video game could ever look or sound this good. I didn't know much about Donkey Kong in 1994, except that it was a really old game, and Billy Madison thought it was the best game ever made. But then I saw a DK Country behind-the-scenes video that really got me hyped for it, and when I finally got to play it, I was enthralled. The graphics were beautiful, the music was nothing short of amazing, and the gameplay was insanely fun, and still is. The sequels were great too, and many argue that the second game is better than the first, but for me, this is the game that I always go back to. DK Country is, and always will be, a bona fide classic. At number 8, I have Super Mario Kart, which I don't have too much to say about. Anyone that grew up with the SNES knows this was one of the most fun games ever made. The novelty of playing as all of the Mario characters in a racing game was intriguing, and once I started playing, I couldn't stop. I wanted to get gold in every cup at every difficulty, and after that there was still the battle mode to enjoy, which I did for countless hours with either my friends or my siblings. I didn't think I'd ever enjoy a game more than I enjoyed this one, and it features visuals and music that, for me at least, are unforgettable. There have been a ton of great Mario Kart games released since, and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe in particular is one of my all-time favorite games, but at any time I can still go back to good old Super Mario Kart for some quick fun and a nice little shot of nostalgia. At number 7, I have Chrono Trigger, which some people might find insulting, as this is seen by a lot of RPG enthusiasts as the best SNES game hands down. But in the early 90s, I had no interest at all in RPGs. It wasn't until I met a friend who had a lot of them in his game collection that I gave the genre a try. I must have been 9 or 10 years old at the time, and I honestly didn't really get much out of games like Final Fantasy and Earthbound, but Chrono Trigger hit a certain sweet spot for me. The combination of great graphics and character designs, entrancing music, an interesting story that was easy for my young mind to follow, and gameplay that I could wrap my head around and ultimately have a lot of fun with. This was a much more visually stimulating game than any of the other RPGs I'd tried at the time, and that really went a long way to increasing my enjoyment of it. I started playing a lot more RPGs as I got older, but this was the one that really sparked my interest in the genre, and it's still a great game to this day. At number 6, I have the one and only Mortal Kombat 2, and this game was my whole life for about a year. I played this game to hell and back, finishing it with every character, learning every fatality, babality, and friendship, and beating all of my friends and even my older brother's friends into a bloody pulp. At 8 or 9 years old, I was so good at MK2 that even the big kids got their asses kicked and their heads knocked off their shoulders. Mortal Kombat was a bit of an obsession for me, in case you couldn't tell, and I have nothing but fond memories with this game. It had great graphics and sound, and gameplay that had me hooked. I loved the original MK, of course, but this one just blew it out of the water. And even though in retrospect there were much better fighting games available at the time, this will always be one of my all-time favorites. The fond memories alone dictated that I include this game on my list, but it is still all kinds of awesome. At number 5 is Super Street Fighter 2. And if Mortal Kombat 2 was my whole life for a year, Street Fighter 2 was my whole life for, most of my life, I guess. I first played the original release in a convenience store that my relatives managed. I was 6 years old at the time, and from then on, I would always have a mild obsession with Street Fighter. I played a ton of both vanilla Street Fighter 2 and Turbo on the SNES, but when yet another iteration of the game was released, this time with improved visuals and sound, and 4 brand new characters to choose from, it was like the world exploded with awesomeness. And for years to come, I would enjoy this game until eventually moving on to Super Turbo and other various fighting games, but I will never forget the time that I spent with this one. It is the best fighting game on the SNES, at least if you ask me. At number 4, I have TMNT 4 Turtles in Time. And now we're getting into favorite games of all time territory, as this is definitely one of my favorite games, not just on the SNES, but on any console. I can't tell you how many hours I spent playing this game over the past 30 years or so. As a kid, I would play through it with every turtle in one sitting, finishing it 4 times over, and then probably starting over again. Despite the fact it's a beat 'em up and the gameplay is as simple as it gets, I never got bored of this game, and I still haven't to this day. The visuals and variety of stages are great, the soundtrack is one of my favorites from any video game, and the gameplay is smooth, fun, and addictive. Made all the better if you have a second player handy. This gets my pick for the best beat 'em up of the 16-bit generation, and one of the best ever. It's a game I'll be able to play and enjoy probably for as long as I live. Next up, at number 3, I have the ever so awesome Super Castlevania IV. And this is a game that had an almost mystic quality to me. The first time I played it, I wasn't able to progress very far. I was only maybe 6 years old, and it was a little too tough for me. But watching my older brother play and progress through it amazed me. It just seemed like such an epic adventure at the time, and the dark threat of Dracula always loomed over everything you did. As I got older and developed more skill for video games, Castlevania IV became one of my favorites. It was one of the first games that I can recall being able to beat all on my own, and eventually a game that I was able to clear without dying. It brought together a combination of beautiful visuals, moody and gothic atmosphere, brilliant music, and absolutely perfect platforming gameplay. In fact, this game in its entirety is, to me, perfect. It's one of the best action platformers ever made, and there's not a single thing that I would change about it. Again, Super Castlevania IV is one of my favorite games ever, and definitely Konami's best game of this generation. Speaking of perfect games, at number 2 I have Mega Man X. And playing this game for the first time when I was 7 years old was almost like having some sort of religious experience. Me and my brother were both huge fans of the 8-bit Mega Man games. In fact, they were our favorite NES games, so when we finally got our hands on Mega Man X, we almost couldn't believe what we were seeing and hearing. It was everything that we loved about the series, but if you'll pardon the cliche, cranked up to 11. The visuals were elaborate and colorful with some absolutely wild enemy designs, and Mega Man, or should I say X, had never looked better. The soundtrack was intense and gave the sense that, again, this was a much more advanced and extreme version of Mega Man, and the gameplay was, and still is, absolutely brilliant. It's intuitive, responsive, challenging, and very fun. This is another one of those games that really kicked my ass the first few times I played it, but over time became a game that I knew like the back of my hand, and despite how many times I'd completed it, I was always happy to start over with a new game and do it all over again. This is another game that I personally see as being without flaw, and I count it as one of my all-time favorite games, and Capcom's greatest game of the 16-bit generation. It's Mega Man X, and it defines the word awesome. And my number 1 favorite SNES game, and I bet nobody saw this coming, considering it's such an obscure little game, but it's The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. This is, to me, the quintessential adventure game, the game that all others that came after it I measured against. It told an epic story, but a story simple enough that anyone can follow it. It's the classic Zelda tale of an unlikely hero battling the forces of evil, finding various objects of power, saving the princess, and ultimately the entire kingdom of Hyrule. This was exactly the game I needed as a kid. It could challenge me without feeling insurmountable, and it gave me a big, interesting world to play around in. It was filled with secrets to uncover, interesting and funny characters to interact with, and some truly epic monsters to contend with. This is a game that cemented my status as a lifelong devoted fan of not just Zelda and Nintendo, but video games as a whole. The visuals, sound, and gameplay are all unforgettable, and I honestly don't know just how many times I've played through this game, and I've never gotten tired of it. Link to the Past is my favorite game of this entire generation of consoles, and one of my favorite games ever. It's a true masterpiece. So that's it, everyone. My top 10 SNES games. I'm sure it was a bit predictable, but that's the thing with these retro games we all obsess over. The classics are classics for a very good reason. They're awesome and almost universally loved. And also, as I said, this list has a large dose of nostalgia in it. And I enjoyed the same games as a kid that I think most other kids did too, so, you know, not so unpredictable. Anyway, feel free to let me know down in the comments what your favorite SNES games are. And if I do another top 10 list like this, what console should I do it on? Your feedback is always welcome. And until next time, this is Jim, and you've been watching Mad Panic Gaming. I'll see you on the next one. Goodbye.